say that, I came into academia in the early 90s, and unlike my predecessors, I was told that you had to do two things. You had to raise money and you had to publish a lot. That was just the beginning of the performance regime in Australia. So I was always in academia within the performance era. I'd never had my expectations created by the previous era when it was important to be a wise scholar and so on and talk well, and those were the things that you had to be. I had to be a performer, and like everyone since. But let me say that in the time in which I've been writing and publishing, my work has been utterly dwarfed by Michael's. He's the most productive scholar in education in the world, without question. If you look at the total number of high-quality papers which he has produced and the books which he has put together, many of which are cited regularly, and some of which, particularly certain papers and chapters, have had a major influence. So it's a great pleasure to be here on Michael's home turf and to share that with you all. And of course it's a great week for New Zealand. I picked up the paper this morning, and Valerie Adams has been restored to her rightful place in the pantheon of the world's leading shot putter again. The Belarus competitor has been rightfully scrubbed out of the medal record. But there's some important lessons for us all in this incident too. I hope none of you have been using performance-enhancing drugs as part of your preparation for this meeting. We know that it's a competitive situation. Academia, jobs are on the line, careers are being made in these kinds of forums. So, use of performance-enhancing drugs is unfair. So leave your performance-enhancing drugs at the door. And I understand that Tina and Michael will be introducing a tough testing regime over the next couple of days. So, now what I want to do with you today is sketch the outlines of what I see as a major geopolitical shift that's taking place in social formation, in person formation, in knowledge production, constituted by the strengthening of the higher education and research systems in East Asia and Singapore. When I say East Asia, I'm going to mean Northeast Asia. Southeast Asia would be separated from that. Now, I'll outline this change in its dimensions in the terms of data and what you might call a kind of political economy take on it. And I'll begin to seek to explain it, but there are many issues about interpretation and about the implications for creativity in particular, which I won't try to enter at this point. I hope that my presentation, though, will provide a backdrop for that kind of discussion about East Asia. Now, I won't discuss the whole of Eurasia. I'm going to focus on the dynamic systems in East Asia and Singapore, which I call the post-Confucian systems, because of their Sinic roots. In fact, you could argue, as I'm going to argue in the presentation, that these systems are a hybrid of their Sinic roots and a largely Western-induced modernisation, which has now become, of course, an indigenous modernisation dynamic of great power. Now, the research universities on the east of the supercontinent already more than balance in scale and volume those on the western end of the supercontinent. And they outstrip the western end already, and greatly so in the rate of growth. The result is that well over half of Asia will be middle class consumers in a generation. And middle class people want university education for their children. In East Asia, the size of the economies already exceeds Australia's. Three economies already exceed Australia. 6 already exceed New Zealand. China will pass the GDP of the United States sometime in the next 5 years. It's not always realised that, except in China and Vietnam, the post-Confucian knowledge economies are very wealthy. GDP per capita is at the level of Western Europe in Japan and Taiwan, and South Korea is getting there. Singapore and the SARs are really rich. China, of course, is grossly uneven in economic modernisation and wealth by region. Shanghai, the Beijing region, and eastern China, coastal China, are much stronger economically than the west of the country. And China's economic development, of course, feeds off this unevenness, which is a source of cheap labour. But China will gradually, of course, move modernisation through all the regions, and that'll be the dynamic of growth for some time to come. The last 2 decades have seen a tremendous expansion in participation in tertiary education in this region, which is moving towards universal levels. It's not following the British model. It's following more the North American model. But it's going past it. The rate of participation in South Korea and Taiwan is already ahead of Canada and the US. The highest participation rates in the world. The gross tertiary enrolment ratio, of course, is the number of tertiary students as a proportion of the school leaver age group. So you can get rates of over 100 if you've got mature age students in the system, as in South Korea. In the SARs in Japan, they're now moving from a kind of British system where there's an assumption that a chunk of people will not go on to tertiary ed towards a universal approach. Singapore and Hong Kong have moved into that belatedly, but they're doing so now. In China, the tertiary enrolment was at 4% in 1990. It's now about 30. Target for 2020 is 40%, which would put it at the current OECD average. The state finances most of the new infrastructure, but families pay an increasing share of the tuition, and that's the case throughout the region, although in Japan and Korea, the family share is much higher than elsewhere. I'll now turn to the growth of research science, which is a big chunk of the middle of my presentation. That is published research in global English language journals in science and parts of the social sciences like economics and psychology, demography, quantitative sociology, the parts that have science-like standard journals. Not much, there's some education there, but not much cultural studies in education is there. It's more the learning theory stuff in the mainstream global journals in education. Work in the humanities and national languages is outside these data. Worldwide, there's a secular trend to growth in the number of science papers each year. You can see that in the graph, in the ascending bars, though this growth is uneven by region. In 1995, there were 38 countries that published more than 1,000 science papers a year. This is a useful proxy, 1,000 papers per year, for an Indigenous research capacity. I mean, countries with 200 or 300 papers per year have them because their PhD students are publishing with their advisors or supervisors in the US or UK or elsewhere. But a country with 1,000 research papers a year does have the capacity to produce its own research and probably its own doctorates. So that's a useful proxy for the spread of the global knowledge economy through different national systems. Now, the number was 38 in 1995. By 2009, there were 49. That's 30% more in 14 years. So you can see how the spread's working. Scientific capacity, like economic modernisation and state building, is becoming ubiquitous. Investment in research until recently was dominated by North America and Western Europe, UK. However, R&D investment in East, Southeast and South Asia is now in total at North American levels. R&D investment in East Asia, by which I mean the Northeast, and Singapore, now exceeds R&D investment in the whole of Europe and the UK. The rate of growth of R&D investment in Korea, Japan and Taiwan is just below the world leaders in Scandinavia. That is, it's in the high 2s to mid 3% of GDP. Finland's the standout at almost 4%. And the percentage of GDP spent on research and development in South Korea, Japan and Taiwan is ahead of Germany and France. China is increasing its R&D investment by 0.1% per annum. Present target is 2.5% of GDP by 2020. At that point, total Chinese R&D will probably exceed that of the United States, although it will not be necessarily as effective or creative of high science. I'll talk about that a little further. In the last 15 years, Asia has seen rapid growth in the number of science papers produced each year. It's been, apart from Latin America, which started from a low base, it's been the most rapidly growing scientific output. The total global science in Asia is now at the level of the United States. These bars give you the growth rates by region a bit more clearly. Mature research systems typically grow slowly. There was almost no change in the number of papers produced in the UK and Japan over the period I'm looking at, which is 14 years after 1995. In the US, growth has been slow. It's the emerging systems where you see it. And this shows very clearly in the next bar graph, which shows growth since 1995 with the yellow part of the bars. You can see that China's science output was minuscule in 1995, on the world scale, but has now moved well past Japan and the UK. And it's still rising. China's science paper output was the same as India's in 1995, but India's has increased more slowly and has now been passed by Korea. Korea's got 1/30 of the population of India. When people say China and India, be sceptical. The knowledge economy boom is not happening in India in the same sense. We could talk about that in discussion. It's really an East Asian phenomenon with one interesting exception. Well, there's two actually. I should mention Iran as an exception as well, but I'm going to also mention Thailand in a minute. But China's output of research papers has grown by 16% per year. I mean, over a 15-year period. I mean, no one ever does that. That's kind of in human history, that hasn't happened before. 16% per year growth is just extraordinary. Now, when the most populated country in the world grows scientific knowledge at unprecedented rates for more than half a generation, and it's going to continue to do so, it's just investments in the pipeline now ensure that this will keep up for another 5 years, even if the R&D investment policy stops tomorrow. And there's no sign of that happening either. So we're going to see another decade, foreseeably at least, of this kind of 15, 20% growth. When that kind of thing happens, it's a game changer worldwide. Because of the scale of that graph, you probably don't get a clear sense of what's happening in Taiwan and Korea. You can see the top bar is Korea, and you can see how dynamic Korea is as well, and also the rate of growth in Taiwan. And in Singapore, the rate of growth has been slightly faster than Taiwan, although it's hard to tell because of the smaller scale of the Singapore output. Thailand is the one non-post-Confucian research system which has seen rapid growth. It's not coming from the state either. It's coming from inside the universities, but it must be said it's coming off a low base. So it's not, I wouldn't read too much into it, but there's clearly a dynamic of Indigenous science in Thailand, which is important and something to think about. Total scientific output per country in Asia is dominated by the post-Confucian systems. You can see the comparison with India there, India with the white bar in the middle. China was almost 4 times as large as India in 2009. Singapore's output now exceeds New Zealand's. Is remarkable for a country of less than 5 million people. Korea has moved past Australia. Arguably, this is the gold medal table that counts. It's about more than just status, although it's also about that. And that's one of the drivers, of course, of all of this, is the desire for national status in a competitive global environment. Global competition states, as was so well put. Looking quickly at the smaller Asian systems, Malaysia continues to disappoint despite its pretensions for being a knowledge economy, something it talks about incessantly. Malaysia's got half the per capita income of Korea. It's not a poor country. Indonesia, there's only about 1 global science paper for every 1 million people. There is not really an indigenous science system. I mean, those global science papers are jointly published with PhD advisors, supervisors in other countries. It will happen, but it hasn't happened yet in Indonesia. And the Philippines is similar. Post-Confucian Vietnam is also similar. Lack of indigenous research capacity at doctoral level, at global doctoral level. Now let's turn now to the position of East Asia and Singapore universities in the research rankings. Unfortunately for me, the Shanghai Jiaotong ranking for 2012 comes out today, and I was sent it all yesterday, so I spent a lot of time after 11 p.m. last night updating in the next few slides. Because unfortunately you've got to go through every figure almost to get them right. Now, research rankings are conservative. They're slow to change. So when you see rapid change in research rankings, that's really astonishing. That's really something. There's a time lag between investment in university research and the increase in science papers. And there's a time lag between the increase in publication numbers and the citations. And there's a time lag between the citations and when they get into the rankings. Some sites don't show up for 5 or 10 years. It depends on the ranking you're talking about. Some of them show up the next year, some of them show up in 10 years. And of course, status is conservative in itself. It slows the recognition of new achievement. Universities hold their status very well. New universities find it hard to emerge at the top and so on. So all these things tend to slow the rate of change in these university ranking tables. Today's changes in rankings probably reflect changes in research investment on average around about the early to mid-2000s, the previous decade. The English language countries still dominate in the Shanghai Jiaotong list of top 200 universities. They've got 119 of the 200, that's almost 60%. The Asian countries have only got 9%, and most of that's in Japan. So no big deal there. Now you can see here that most of that global research power is expressed in the rankings is in Japan and in the established system in Hong Kong, which is very strong, and in Singapore, where again, the two universities are really very good and they've been established for some time. But the interesting thing about the 2012 results is that whereas in 2011 there was only Tsinghua from China in the top 200, in 2012 Beida, Peking University, has got in there, and Shanghai Jiaotong itself, and Zhejiang is also there. It's a very large Zhejiang so in terms of scientific output, and that's what size has driven that. But those four are now in the top 200, so suddenly there's a jump, there's a change. Let's have a quick look at the table for this year for Australia and New Zealand, because you haven't seen it. I mean, it's not out. It's going out at 11 today, and it's interesting, of course. We all want to see where our universities are. All the Australians have gone up except Queensland, or they've stayed the same. Only Queensland was the only one of the 19 who went down, which is very interesting. And we're trying to explain it all, but we think it's due to a favourable conjunction of circumstances towards the end of the last decade, when there's a big surge in international income, at the same time as the Labor government restored full indexation, stabilised the system and put $1.5 billion into research infrastructure and projects. So there's all these things happened in the same year or two, around 2008-9, and that seems to have given the Vice-Chancellors even more licence to concentrate all their investments in research to build their era position within the country and their global ranking position, because it certainly hasn't gone into teaching, because staffing ratios haven't changed, as far as we can see. So yes, the favourable conjunction of circumstances, a radical shift away from public funding, which is likely to happen in the next period, will probably see the reverse configuration, because the international market's also down as well. But however, that's what's happened to the Australians, and that's that means that Australia and New Zealand as a bloc compare pretty well with East Asia at the moment, at this point of time. But I'm going to show you a bit more about that comparison in a second. Now, let's touch base with Shanghai Jiaotong results and China. The number of world-class universities in mainland China up from 8 in 2005 to 28 in 2012. That's an extraordinary shift in this kind of ranking. 985 program funding is lifted to the top 39, and well, clearly 28 of them here, and maybe more to come in. Hong Kong has now got all its 5 strongest universities in the top 300, although none are in the top 100. They're all between 100 and 300 point, but that's a very strong result for Hong Kong. And in Taiwan too, the number of top 500 universities is up. Meanwhile, the number in Japan's been going down, and in Korea, it went from 8 in 25 to 11 in 2011, but went down by 1 this year. But that's just a little change at the margin. The Shanghai Jiaotong folk also do look at research performance by broad research field. This is a little bit hard to quickly take in, but the post-Confucian systems are in red. What you can see, I think, if you follow the engineering column, which is the second column of figures, you'll see that the post-Confucian systems do pretty well in engineering. That's the clear strength, the strong area, and we'll come to that again later. I'm now going to turn to the best data set, this is where I start to really believe the figures, if you like. Composite rankings like Shanghai Jiaotong, 5 different indicators all combined, it's always problematic. But when you're looking at single indicator tables like Leiden University develops, you've got something solid to hang on to there. It hasn't been run through the lens of the rankers themselves, and their assumptions about weights between indicators haven't come into play here. These are just single indicators. Leiden publishes rankings in relation to total science output and in the number of high citation papers in the top 10% in their field, and it also looks at things like average cites per paper, and it looks at the percentage of papers that are published that are in the top 10% in the field, which is a useful indicator of how good your papers are. And I'll use that indicator a bit here. Essentially, as I said, trustworthy data. What you see is what you get. East Asia has 2 large universities in Japan in the world top 12. You can see there that at Harvard, by far the biggest, of course, player, fish in the pond, 33,000 published science papers over a 5-year period, tremendous output, and cites per paper 16.5, and 22.5% of those papers are in the top 10% in their field. MIT is the standout on that indicator with 25.2%. So a quarter of MIT's papers are in the top 10% in their field, which is a phenomenal level of quality. And the Americans, of course, dominate this table. I'll just show you Sao Paulo. That's interesting, isn't it? Number 8, isn't it? It's very big. Brazil is the player in terms of Latin American R&D at the moment. There's a lot of smaller institutes outside the university sector which do a lot of things, and some universities are beginning to become serious. Now, looking now at the Asia Pacific, total paper measure, which favours large universities with broad-based research capacity and reasonable intensity across that capacity. It puts 4 Japanese universities in the Asia Pacific top 12 and 3 from China, 2 from Australia. Now, the next table ranks universities on the basis of their citation rates, the proportion of their papers in the top 10% in the field. Now, this is a very interesting table. 2 things to note about it. First, the presence of a significant group of science and technology specialists with high cite rates in Asia. And Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, the regional star, founded in 1991, it's achieved it all in 21 years. It's been an astonishing story, the HKUST story. Very impressive place. It's in the world top 100 in social sciences, as well as being very strong in engineering and technologies and raw science. But there's also there's more Hong Kong universities that are strong in this list. There's 2 more, and of course Hong Kong universities are very strong in humanities as well. Some of them, so they're pretty interesting places at the moment. There's also, though, this group in China. China, with its unevenness, with its focus on mega institutions, nonetheless has developed an interesting group of medium-sized S&T specialists. Nankai is a standout. We have a PhD student from Nankai, best student we've ever had at the Centre for the Study of Higher Education, in my opinion. She's already effectively progressed about 18 months in 4 or 5. Really, really good. Tremendous intellectual formation, but she went to Beida. She then worked at Nankai. There's also Lanzhou, and there's Jilin and a couple of others just below this group in China as well. And POSTECH in Korea, which is a private university, which is a very interesting place as well. But note also the National University of Singapore, the second thing I wanted to mention. National University of Singapore beats all of the Australian universities in terms of total paper output, and it was also well ahead of them on the percentage of papers in the top 10%. The cite rate, 13.8. This is the fact I use to try to bring to the attention of Australian policymakers the fact that we're being passed by the research systems of East Asia. This performance of National University of Singapore, it's now the strongest university in the southeast corner of Asia region, in our part of the world. NUS is number 1. Very interesting. So we look at this table, which gives us a quantity of quality. This is the number of, this is raw firepower, if you like, the number of top 10% papers coming out. I put University of Cambridge there to give you the comparison. The strongest UK university, number 12 in the world, 2,351 papers in this group. You can see there that, oops, I put University of Tokyo, South Korea. That's what happens when you do things at 2 in the morning, you know. You really make mistakes. That should be Japan, obviously. I hope there's no more mistakes in the table. But the institutions are correctly listed, as are the numbers, so that looks all right. But you can see there that NUS, 31st in the world on the raw firepower measure. Tsinghua, 47, Zhejiang, 50, Seoul National at 54, National Taiwan at 72, those big national leader, system leader institutions. No, 3 Australians and no New Zealanders there as yet, but perhaps if a few get scrubbed out for performance-enhancing drugs, we might be able to squeeze a few more of us Australians and New Zealanders up in the table. There's the second list, the second 11 or second 12, I think it is. You can see there, University of Science and Technology, one of these medium-sized Chinese university specialising in S&T. That's the University of the Academy of Sciences. Shanghai Jiaotong, which is large, is there probably partly. Fudan, which is moderate in size but strong in quality across many disciplines, and Nanjing, which is a good place, which is a strong scientific tradition, to some extent against the National Party state in Beidar, but it has now been brought into the fold and is in the C9 group. And KAIST in Korea, a very strong research specialist as well. So these are strong places. Now, East Asia still has a way to go, though. I compiled a list of all universities in the world that had more than 5,000 science papers in the Leiden ranking and had 10% of their research papers in the top 10% in their field. And had at least 10%, a minimum of 10% of the papers in the top 10% in the field. Sorry if that's confusing. There were 64 such universities in the US where there's a citation factory, people cite each other, but also there's high quality and it's well spread. 47 in Western Europe, but only 12 in Asia. That's because of the site measure. Site quality is not there yet. There are 38 Asia-Pacific universities which meant the benchmark on quantity, but most of them were not there on quality. But citation rates, like paper volumes, are improving fast, as I'm about to show you. Now let's look at high citation papers. These are top 1% papers here, not top 10%. These are the sort of cream of global science. In 2010, the United States had 28% of the world's science papers, but it had 49% of the top 1% papers. So that's where thought is still being largely led from. China had only 4% of the top 1% papers. Quite small in comparison. No contest there, you might say. Well, the Asia 8, which includes Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, had 3%. So only 7% between the two in East Asia. But the patterns vary by discipline. In engineering, China had 12% of the top 1% papers. The Asia 8 had 9%. That's 21% compared to 39% in the US. So it starts to look a bit more balanced there. In chemistry, China had 11%. Mathematics, 9%. Physics, 8%. China is very strong in the disciplines that relate to construction, urban design, transport systems, energy, computing, materials, communications, and so on. Lots of a big budget applied science stuff with modernisation implications. That's where China's put its research effort at this point of time. But it's a characteristic of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. They're really strong in engineering and related areas. China and the Asia 8 are weak in research in medicine and the life sciences, except agriculture to some extent. China and the Asia 8 between them had only 2% of the world's top papers in medicine, and the United States had 54%. Very interesting. So the biomedical revolution is yet, which is major influence in research in Western Europe, in Netherlands, Switzerland, and so on, not yet really happening, except a little bit in Hong Kong and Singapore. Japan to some extent. But the most important point to note is the citation rates are improving very fast. In 2000, China had only 0.6% of the world's top papers in chemistry. 0.6. By 2010, that's a decade later, 0.6 had become 10.6. That's a very rapid rate of change. So, we can look to continual improvement in those cite rates in the disciplines that China has chosen to specialise in. The question is whether research capacity is going to spread more broadly. So an increasing proportion of our knowledge will come from East Asia. And this does not necessarily mean that East Asia's role in leading edge research and breakthrough ideas, let alone major new concepts and innovations and inventions, will rise in proportion. But all else being equal, it provides more favourable conditions for high creativity. So mostly the concentration of talent in places where the material conditions for productive work are strong. Now let's recap on what the post-Confucian systems are achieving. Rapid growth in educational participation funded by both public and private sources in a way that just almost seems seamless. Not the same argument. We have a perpetual argument in Australia about fees and university funding systems. That's our whole politics is around those issues. These issues are not, while they're important, there are issues of interest involved in East Asia. They're not the core controversies in the system. They're not the things which drive the politics and never get solved and never get settled. It's relatively seamless by comparison. The creation of world-class universities rapidly and at scale. The extraordinarily rapid growth of research scientific output. Within relatively low spending fiscal settings, we're looking at polities with a GDP share in taxation of between 10 and 20%, not 35% or 50%, as in the English-speaking countries or Western Europe. So, how do they do it? They've ticked every box, it seems. The English-speaking countries can't do this, that we trade off participation for research funding or quality for quantity. Fiscal policy seems to restrict everything all the time. Well, in moving towards an explanation, I've isolated 5 conditions. 1, economic growth and the demands of a rising middle class, which needs to be given education as its social present by governments that want to maintain social order, and that's core and central to their identity, long-term social order. I've already talked about that aspect, but there's also others. There's the key role played by the comprehensive form of state in the Sinic tradition. There's deep Confucian habits in education in the home and in the society. There's modernisation, high capitalism, and the desire to catch up to the West. And the use of effective state-driven strategies of internationalisation, international cooperation, international competition, international borrowing, international adaptation. The East Asian state has an extraordinary ability to set targets and achieve them. The East Asian state arguably has its origins in the Qin and Han dynasties in China. The key to understanding this kind of state, which is very different in some respects to the limited liberal state of the Adam Smith tradition in the English-speaking countries, is that government and politics are supreme vis-a-vis the economy, the cities, civil society and the professions. There aren't the same spaces of autonomy. Government is, in a sense, ubiquitous, although it has developed over a very long period, an advanced capacity to delegate in certain ways. But whereas the tongue and the song never really penetrated, or the Han tongue and song never really penetrated right to the level of the village, the modern state is more capable at that level, at least when the village reaches the city. It still needs to delegate, though. It doesn't direct on a daily basis. It can't. So you've got a different mix of devolution and centralisation. You've got a different mix between state and non-state activity. In the English-speaking countries where the limited liberal state prevails, I mean, society is framed by this standoff between state and market and state and civil society. I mean, it's central to our identity as in institutional frames, that standoff. Much of the political debate turns around questions about legitimacy of state intervention. Anti-statism is a core element of our politics. The US, of course, exemplifies this to the most advanced degree, where freedom, in some respects, seems to have become, notions of freedom have become centred on anti-statism, and the right to carry guns, in a sense, is the right to be anti-statist, as well as protect yourself from your neighbours. The politics of higher education turns in our countries on issues of state-university tension. University autonomy is a central contested space. It's a very ambiguous issue, but we don't acknowledge that. We see it as a pristine value. The tension, that tension's a part of East Asian higher education as well, but the state-non-state polarity does not frame everything. It's all within the state, in a sense. The university sector, including the regulated private sector, Korea is a classic example, is within, some sense, within the state in East Asia in a way that it's not outside East Asia. The second element is the tradition of self-cultivation via education. I mean, this first flowers on a mass basis not in the Han period, but in the Song period 1,000 years ago. In the Song era, the imperial examination begins to take in a much larger group of candidates, becomes a core instrument of upward mobility on a larger scale. You still had to go to the small number of imperial metropolises to sit the examination. So it also was a form of centralisation. Confucian educational traditions run deeper in East Asia than the commitment to education in the West, which is, Prussia, England, 200 years old. When Commander Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbour, the rate of participation in the mid-19th century, the rate of participation in schooling in Japan was already at the most advanced levels of Western Europe, and the participation rate of girls was half that of boys, and that was ahead of any country in Western Europe at that time. So that was under the Tokugawa, the Edo period in Japan, which inherited the Neo-Confucian tradition and very strongly expressed and redeveloped it. And education was at the centre of what it did. Many families in East Asia, even some very poor families, spend as much of their household income in proportional terms on education for their children as the English-speaking families spend on housing in our part of the world. This extends beyond formal education to include shadow schooling, extra classes, private tutoring. In Korea, families spend more on shadow schooling for their children than most countries, or many countries, spend on the whole formal schooling system. So when you see that low figure for Korea's GDP share of education spending in the OECD stats, which come out in another 3 weeks, remember that shadow schooling is actually, the percentage of GDP being spent on shadow schooling is probably larger than that figure for schooling. Amazing. And overworked children are a key social problem in East Asia. All my colleagues in China say, I'm not a tiger mum, I'm not a tiger dad. And they say, I give my kids piano lessons, They get to they visit their friends, they have some physical exercise, they have breaks. I say, you cannot study more than a certain number of hours a day. But of course, they still achieve really well because they're from academic families and the expectations are built in from birth in the same way. The Australian government, in reading the results of PISA in the last 12 months, has made the mistake of attributing the difference between Australia's performance and East Asian performance to the quality of teaching. It's not. It's about the home, and it's about the relationship between the home and the child and the school, with much of the value add occurring in shadow schooling, not through formal schooling anyway. And that's schooling driven by the home. So look at those PISA results. I find this absolutely startling and gobsmacking. These stellar performances of these systems, especially in mathematics. Shanghai comes into PISA, 30 million people, an affluent part of the country certainly, but not as affluent perhaps as Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore. And Shanghai goes off the charts. The results are genuine. They're properly administered. In Shanghai, they're busily worrying about how they can improve further, and their rote learning rate is below the OECD average. So you've got to jettison a lot of assumptions about this. This is genuine capacity. 35% of students in Shanghai can do advanced maths compared to, at the 15-year-olds, compared to 2% in the US. There's a very different level of educated capacity in East Asia compared to most other countries. This is very interesting and important. The Confucian tradition in education, with its meritocratic hierarchy mediated by the examination, also shapes the style of system organisation in higher education. All post-Confucian systems, with the exception of Hong Kong, which has inherited a big chunk of British values, and have done quite well out of a hybrid tradition, in fact, are led by a handful of highly prestigious universities, with one peak research university at the head of every system: Seoul National, National Taiwan, Todai, Tokyo University. In China, of course, there are two. There's Beida and Tsinghua. Now, all families aspire to get their children into these institutions. It's absolutely central social value. One thing people have in common, it's that in East Asia. Except in Korea, the leading universities are all state universities. In Korea, Seoul National is, but Nonsai and KU are not. They're private institutions. But in all the other countries, the leading institutions are all state universities, including in Japan, where really Keio and Waseda are important leadership training places, but they're still overshadowed by the imperial group, really, certainly by Todai. At the peak of the system in the state universities, the students there have the highest level of state subsidy, they have the best loan arrangements, they pay the least in terms of private costs, they have the best scholarships and so on. And it's the bottom of the system, the families pay the most proportion of costs, the state is least supportive and so on. But what's interesting is that the state does not need to fund participation at the bottom end. I mean, in the English-speaking world, Western Europe, states have to put out money to extend the frontiers of participation to more and more families that haven't been in tertiary education before. In these countries, you only have to get them to a certain standard of living, and they invest. They do it all. It's the Confucian tradition. It's the core of identity. Internationalisation strategies have been very instrumental in the rapid emergence not of research universities in China and also to a degree in Korea, where internationalisation is probably less thoroughgoing, and Japan. Previous to that, Taiwan too. In Taiwan, it's been very important, and in Singapore, perhaps most of all, has been a site of creative adaptation and borrowing, and particularly the use of global benchmarks in all these countries, in all these systems. So it's the willingness to do comparison, to do realistic comparison, to not believe your own marketing rhetoric that you're number one, blah, 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 blah. And this proves that they don't approach the problem that way. They tend to underplay rather than overplay their standard, their own achievement, to try and drive improvement, instead of marketing to try and drive status within their own systems. Post-Confucian education, I think, can only be understood as a combination of traditional elements, the Sinic state, Confucian educational tradition, and so on, in the home, with this Western-driven modernisation, initially via colonialism and economic competition, although now by state-orchestrated programs of catch-up to the West, which began in Meiji Japan, which was so spectacularly successful, and that's been the great example. But the same kind of extraordinarily accelerated modernisation, state-driven modernisation has occurred in all of these systems except in Vietnam. This modernisation does not necessarily steer China, Korea, Taiwan, etc. into a convergence with the US and Europe in higher education and research. It does in some respects, but not in others. As these systems become stronger on the world scale, arguably, their distinctive national characteristics are likely to become more rather than less apparent over time. This is very important, of course. Much depends on whether that's true. But the strength of Indigenous traditions is clear when you go to universities in the region. What's less clear is capacity to turn that strength into global prototypes. Japan has only been able to do this at the level of soft power. But then Japan is more insular than the others. It's not the typical post-Confucian. It's the least typical in some respects, although it was the most early developed. And one suspects that China and Korea will be more effective in reaching out and establishing a global influence. And of course, the Confucius Institutes are an early attempt to do that. Now, what are the implications of the Sinic state for academic freedom and university autonomy? Does the Sinic state and the Confucian tradition inhibit creativity? I mean, it's not a simple question to answer. The question itself presumes a global norm of academic freedom that we can use as a benchmark to judge everyone by. A common approach to university autonomy. This doesn't exist. So we have to make a normative judgment about what benchmarks we use, or whether we in fact need to embrace something which is more plural. The Sinic state was always a delegating state. As I said, it had to be. You couldn't control China by trying to control it from one location top down and deal with that vast territory with poor communications and so on in the Han era. So you had to delegate. And universities to some extent inherit that tradition. Whether you're talking about single-party states or multi-party states, it's all much the same. They all have practical autonomy up to a point. Characteristically, though, the state retains the capacity to intervene. And often it intervenes through the selection of leaders or through influencing the selection of leaders. I mean, in Singapore has now moved to what's seen as the global norm. The University Council, National University of Singapore, selects the president, but no one thinks that it's ever going to select a president who would not be at the utmost level of favour with the Singapore government. I mean, everything depends on the synchronisation between the university and the government for the university's remarkable continued success. In the English-speaking countries, academic freedom, like all forms of individual freedom, is understood in terms of Berlin's negative freedom, freedom from coercion or constraint by the state, or perhaps by university managers. Freedom from constraint. It's less often understood in terms of positive freedom, freedom to do something, the capacity to do something, the enabling conditions of action. Now, in the Sinic tradition, the empowerment of the scholar is understood more in terms of authority and responsibility than in terms of negative freedom. I mean, all academics working in all places want to be able to say and do what they want. That goes without saying. It's a question of what institutional forms that say and do as you want will take. The authority and responsibility of the scholar is nevertheless highly attractive as a social role in the post-Confucian world, and one that delivers much gravitas to the actions of the scholar. Arguably, there's more gravitas attached to a university professor in the Sinic world than there is in the English-speaking world. There's also, perhaps in that respect, it's a little closer to the German tradition as it was. There's also a long tradition in China of scholarly criticism of particular actions of states, or particular regimes of state. When the state becomes deficient or corrupted, then it's the duty of the scholar to speak out. Or so one tradition says. It's the duty of the scholar to maintain a continuing supervision from outside of state activity, and to raise issues in relation to deficiency as a public matter. So but essentially what that means is as a matter of within the state to the state. Now, Peking universities inherited this role in China. It's understood to have this role. It's a central institution in a way which Harvard is not. It's right at the heart of the country. It's politically. Remember, politics is in command. Politics is the most important organising form in the country now, and Beidar is right in the middle of politics. It's been the point at which most oppositional movements of the 20th century started. Some were successful, some were not. Tiananmen began as an oppositional movement at Beidar, which sought to persuade the government to govern as a government should govern. Not an overthrow of government, not a replacement of it with a plural democracy. It sought to secure a change of policy in a number of areas which would constitute government governing as it should govern. And that's the classic oppositional stance. That's the classic role of the scholar. That's the classic notion of responsibility, the public responsibility of the scholar. The Cultural Revolution began at Beidar with the denunciation of the university president by a group of activists. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, when it was formally called off, the Beidar president was still in power. The same person was still there. It's a really important institution, and its role is partly one of liberal criticism and opposition. But when you go to Beidar, go to a conference there, most people you meet are party members, and most people you meet are critical of the government. They've got, especially about higher education policy, and they make those criticisms known. It's feisty. There's more argument, more criticism of an effective kind, perhaps, than there is in our tradition, where we mouth opposition as a ritual, but none of it has much clout. But in Beidar, it matters what people say, because it's within the state. The universities are within the state, and there's much debate and criticism within the state and within the party. At least in this period. Of course, it can close down too. It can close up, and has done so in other periods. And then the Beidar critics go back to their burrows. They don't necessarily get removed, but they go quiet for a while and wait for their opportunity for normal business to resume. So there is this, but there's a limit to this critical role. And when the professor of life sciences, Rao Yi, who was brought back from the US in great fanfare, he's a great research scientist in world terms, and a great appointment at the time for Beidar. It was the right appointment by all reports. He raised the issue of cronyism in research grant allocation, which is a cancer in the research system. Merit is not, peer review and merit are not determining in many respects. State cronyism, dealing with bureaucrats, getting on the inside track, with grand selection is the way to go. And he raised this criticism of this, and his counterpart at Tsinghua signed the letters with him, but he was the main activist. When his name came up for membership of the Chinese Academy of Sciences that year, he was denied membership, which was a scandal, and it was purely and simply a political payback. So he was, in other words, stripped of some of his authority. And his authority is central to his social role. This is how the game is being played. So it's a different debate to the one we have. Now, let me move to summarise. What I've called the post-Confucian model of higher education has certain distinctive features. I mean, these are shared to a striking extent between the different systems in higher education. All the Ys indicate compliance with the features of the model. You can see that Taiwan and Korea are model versions of the model. China's getting there as well. Hong Kong is a more hybrid place, has mixed characteristics. Japan achieved the model, but is no longer as dynamic, no longer dynamic in the way the others are. Singapore is largely there. In Vietnam is the outlier. Vietnam has not succeeded in turning its post-Confucian educational culture into a post-Confucian take-off in the knowledge economy and research. There's obvious reasons for that. It has the comprehensive Sinic state tradition, but its present state lacks the capacity to focus on education and research objectives, and national wealth is the inhibiting factor. At an average income of $3,500 per capita, which is less than half that of China, in a more concentrated, less regionalised economy, Vietnam is not in a position yet to invest on this kind of accelerated scale. The post-Confucian systems are engaged in global science and in many respects follow the template of Anglo-American universities. They're also distinctive in some respects. And their distinctiveness seems to derive from two elements common to all systems in the group that I've emphasised in this paper: the comprehensive Sinic state and the Confucian educational tradition in the home and in social relations through the examination. These elements hybridise with the Western drivers of modernisation and with the re-indigenisation of those drivers in contemporary capitalist economies in a complex way. But those traditions are distinctive. They do define, there are no other systems which share these characteristics. There are no other systems which share this dynamism. State-fed investment in research in Iran has driven tremendous growth in Iran, but there's not the same mix of post-Confucian characteristics in other respects, such as the drivers in the home and the shared funding and so on. What you've seen there is more force-fed science, and that's been an isolated aspect rather than part of a post-Confucian system approach. In Thailand, you've seen this spurt of growth in research science, but again, the rest of the characteristics of the Confucian systems are not there. Many countries will no doubt want to imitate the post-Confucian takeoff, which is so striking and spectacular. Many of them will share the assumption that is being made in East Asia, that there's a strong connection between investment in R&D and university education and economic dynamism, which is, I think, very arguable and where the evidence base is poor. In fact, arguably, the investment in R&D and university participation follows rather than leads economic dynamism. But nonetheless, it becomes rationalised in the reverse causality. The two rise together, perhaps, is a kinder way of putting the problem, although they do so in a staggered way. Eventually, there will be disillusionment in East Asia when it's realised that university continuous increases in university research investment and aren't necessarily delivering obvious economic and social outcomes. But meanwhile, the middle class will be accommodated, and that's perhaps as important as anything else in driving all of this, because the middle class participation and the great game of the meritocracy is key to social order, as it always has been in the Han world, in the Sinic world. The rise of East Asia, I think, means the new world has come. I mean, the American higher education system continues to lead the world, overwhelmingly so, in research science and in scholarly production in all disciplines. It will remain the most important place for us for the foreseeable future. Whether the American university is as strong in high creativity or feeding the spirit of creativity beyond the university is another question. My colleague Peter Murphy has much to say on that question. Much Same comment can be made about the University in East Asia. I mean, whether there's a link between this remarkable fluorescence in the institution in a formal sense, especially in research science in East Asia, and social and economic outcomes. As I said, it's another question. What's clear is that these states are putting many eggs in the university basket. Social aspirations are being focused there. And the East Asian universities are going to be the home of a vast number of highly capable and productive people. Rise of East Asia means a new world has come. It'll certainly be a multipolar university world. This radically changes our strategic orientation. It means we need to learn some languages. And we have not seen anything like this before, not with this stretch and scale. It seems to me that it's the major strategic fact of our time, and it's one which we must not hesitate to get to grips with. Thanks.